In December 1941, as German forces retreated from Moscow under Soviet counteroffensive, Adolf Hitler issued an order that Wehrmacht commanders immediately recognized as operationally dangerous. All retreats were forbidden regardless of tactical situation. Professional military doctrine emphasized that defensive operations required tactical flexibility. Commanders must be able to conduct local withdrawals to avoid encirclement, preserve forces, and establish stronger positions. Hitler rejected this doctrine entirely. He ordered that German forces would hold every position and that any retreat without explicit authorization would result in commander being relieved. Wehrmacht field commanders warned that blanket prohibition on retreats eliminated tactical flexibility essential for defensive operations. Hitler dismissed these warnings. He believed Moscow crisis was caused by unauthorized retreats undermining morale, and that absolute standfast orders would restore defensive stability. That decision, to forbid tactical flexibility and require static defense regardless of circumstances, would systematically destroy German defensive capabilities across every theater for remainder of war. Professional military judgment said flexibility was essential for effective defense. Political decision required rigidity that professional assessment warned would guarantee force destruction whenever circumstances required tactical adjustment. Wehrmacht operational doctrine was explicit about defensive operations. Tactical flexibility was essential. Professional military training taught that defense required constant adjustment based on enemy actions and local conditions. Commanders must be able to conduct fighting withdrawals, establish new defensive lines, refuse flanks, and avoid encirclement. German military tradition emphasized initiative and decentralized command. Field commanders made tactical decisions based on local situation without requiring authorization from higher command. This doctrine had proven effective in previous campaigns. Professional staff officers were trained that rigid static defense led to force destruction when enemy achieved breakthrough or envelopment. The solution was flexible defense. Trade space for time, preserve forces, maintain coherent defensive line. Wehrmacht tactical manuals provided detailed guidance on conducting defensive withdrawals properly. Professional military education emphasized that knowing when to retreat was as important as knowing when to attack. German military effectiveness was based partly on this tactical flexibility. When Hitler ordered that all retreats were forbidden, professional commanders recognized this contradicted fundamental doctrine about defensive operations. The order eliminated tactical tool that professional assessment said was essential for effective defense. Hitler's no-retreat order emerged from December 1941 Moscow crisis. Soviet counteroffensive had pushed German forces back from Moscow. Some Wehrmacht commanders conducted tactical retreats without authorization, falling back to more defensible positions. These retreats were militarily sound. Commanders were avoiding encirclement and preserving forces. Hitler interpreted them differently. He believed unauthorized retreats were causing panic and undermining defensive cohesion. He concluded that Moscow crisis was not military problem requiring tactical adjustments, but morale problem requiring absolute determination. Professional Wehrmacht assessment was that Soviet winter offensive had achieved operational surprise with fresh forces, and German tactical retreats were appropriate response preserving forces for continued operations. Hitler rejected professional military analysis. He insisted problem was psychological, not operational. His solution was to forbid all retreats and require every position be held regardless of circumstances. Wehrmacht commanders objected that this would prevent proper defensive operations. Hitler's response was that willpower and determination mattered more than tactical flexibility. The no-retreat order was presented as temporary emergency measure for Moscow crisis. It would become permanent policy overriding professional doctrine about defensive operations.
Implementation of no-retreat order was immediate and brutal.
Wehrmacht field commanders who conducted tactical withdrawal. In early 1942, approximately 100,000 German troops were encircled at Demyansk.
Wehrmacht commanders requested authorization to break out. Hitler ordered them to hold positions. The pocket was supplied by airlift for months.
Eventually, German forces held until relief operation reached them. Hitler cited Demyansk as proof that no-retreat policy worked. Forces that stood firm were eventually relieved.
Professional military assessment was completely different.
Demyansk succeeded because specific conditions existed. Air superiority allowed sustained airlift. Soviet forces were not strong enough to crush pocket. Relief forces were available. These conditions were exceptional, not typical.
Wehrmacht staff warned that Demyansk should not be template for all encirclement situations. Most pockets would not have favorable conditions that allowed Demyansk to succeed. Hitler rejected these warnings. He insisted Demyansk prove standing firm was always correct answer. The exception became policy. Professional military judgment said each encirclement situation was unique and required tactical assessment about whether holding or breaking out was appropriate. Political decision was that Demyansk's success meant all encircled forces should hold regardless of conditions. Operational doctrine about tactical flexibility was being replaced by rigid policy based on single exceptional case. In November 1942, 6th Army was encircled at Stalingrad. Wehrmacht commanders immediately recommended breakout army should abandon city and retreat to avoid destruction. This was exactly what professional doctrine said was correct. When encircled, assess whether conditions favor holding or breaking out. Stalingrad conditions clearly favored breakout, no air superiority for reliable supply, Soviet forces strong enough to crush pocket, no relief forces immediately available. Professional military assessment was unanimous: breakout now or army will be destroyed. Hitler ordered 6th Army to hold. His reasoning was Demyansk precedent and no-retreat policy. Forces that stood firm would be relieved. Wehrmacht staff presented detailed analysis showing Stalingrad was not Demyansk, conditions were completely different and unfavorable for holding. Hitler dismissed analysis. Standfast order was final. 6th Army held through December and January. Airlift failed due to lack of air superiority. Soviet forces tightened encirclement. Relief attempt failed. In February 1943, 6th Army surrendered, over 250,000 troops lost. Professional military doctrine had been correct, breakout in November would have saved Army. No-retreat policy prevented implementing professional judgment and guaranteed force destruction. Demyansk exception had created rigid rule that destroyed entire army when conditions required tactical flexibility. After Stalingrad disaster, Wehrmacht commanders expected no-retreat policy would be reconsidered. They presented comprehensive analysis showing rigid standfast orders had directly caused 6th Army destruction. Professional military staff recommended return to doctrinal flexibility, allow commanders to make tactical decisions about when retreats were necessary based on local conditions. Hitler refused to change policy. He insisted Stalingrad failure was not caused by no-retreat order but by insufficient determination and failed relief operation. The blanket prohibition on retreats remained in force. Wehrmacht was required to continue following policy that professional assessment proved was catastrophically wrong. Field commanders who hoped Stalingrad would demonstrate cost of eliminating tactical flexibility were disappointed. The pattern was established: even massive disasters resulting directly from rigid orders would not change policy requiring static defense regardless of circumstances. Professional military expertise about defensive operations continued to be overridden by political insistence on absolute no-retreat principle. Germany would repeat Stalingrad's mistake repeatedly because decision-making structure prevented learning from operational failures when lessons conflicted with political leadership's commitment to rigid stand-fast policy. Wehrmacht field commanders from 1943 onward faced systematic impossible situation. Professional military judgment often indicated that tactical retreat was necessary to avoid encirclement, preserve forces, or establish better defensive positions. No-retreat policy forbade withdrawals without authorization. Requesting authorization required time and exposed commander to potential relief if request was denied or if retreat occurred before authorization arrived. Commanders had three choices: obey doctrine and risk relief, obey orders and risk force destruction, or attempt to disguise retreats as tactical adjustments. All three options were professionally unacceptable. Professional military system was designed to give field commanders authority to make tactical decisions based on local conditions. No-retreat policy centralized all withdrawal decisions under Hitler, who made choices based on political considerations without understanding local tactical reality. The result was systematic degradation of German defensive effectiveness. Commanders could not employ tactical flexibility the doctrine said was essential. Forces were repeatedly trapped and destroyed in situations where professional assessment indicated retreat was necessary. Wehrmacht had professional expertise to conduct effective defensive operations, but decision-making structure prevented implementing that expertise whenever it required tactical withdrawals that political policy forbade. In January 1944, approximately 60,000 German troops were encircled at Cherkasy. Wehrmacht commanders requested breakout authorization. Professional assessment was that pocket should break out immediately while forces were still combat effective. Hitler ordered standfast. He insisted pocket would be relieved as Demyansk had been. Wehrmacht staff presented analysis showing relief was unlikely and holding would result in gradual force destruction. Analysis was ignored. German forces held for weeks. Soviet pressure increased. Relief attempts failed. Finally, in February, with situation desperate, Hitler authorized breakout. By then, forces were severely weakened. Breakout succeeded, but with heavy losses. Approximately half the pocket's strength was destroyed. Professional military assessment was bitter. If breakout had been authorized in January when first requested, entire force would have escaped intact. Delay caused by no-retreat policy resulted in unnecessary destruction of 30,000 troops. This was Stalingrad pattern repeating. Professional judgment correctly identified what tactics required, political policy prevented implementation until circumstances made success impossible. The cost of eliminating tactical flexibility was accumulating. Each pocket that should have broken out early but was ordered to stand fast added to total forces destroyed by rigid policy overriding operational expertise. Soviet operational planning from 1943 onward deliberately exploited German no-retreat policy. Soviet commanders understood that German forces would not conduct tactical retreats even when encirclement threatened. This made German defensive operations predictable. Soviet offensive planning could assume German forces would remain in forward positions even after flanks were penetrated. Wehrmacht tactical doctrine had emphasized unpredictability through flexible response to enemy actions. No-retreat policy made German defense completely predictable. Forces would hold positions regardless of tactical developments. This gave Soviets enormous operational advantage. They could conduct deep penetrations knowing German forces would not retreat from salients even when envelopment was obvious. Professional Wehrmacht staff documented this explicitly. They presented analysis showing Soviets were successfully exploiting German rigidity to create repeated encirclements. They calculated that return to tactical flexibility would restore defensive unpredictability and force Soviets to adapt. Hitler rejected analysis. No retreat policy remained unchanged. Soviet planning continued exploiting predictable German static defense. Germany had handed enemies reliable method for destroying German forces by making defensive operations predictable through policy forbidding tactical flexibility that doctrine said was essential for effective defense. When Western Allied forces invaded France in 1944, Wehrmacht commanders in West faced same no-retreat policy that had devastated Eastern Front defense. Professional assessment was that mobile defense trading space for time was appropriate response to Allied material superiority. Hitler ordered static defense with no retreats. Wehrmacht commanders in Normandy requested permission to conduct fighting withdrawals to more defensible positions. Requests were denied. Forces were ordered to hold forward positions regardless of tactical developments. Allied breakout at St. Lo trapped German forces that professional judgment said should have retreated weeks earlier. Falaise Pocket encircled approximately 100,000 troops, direct result of no retreat orders preventing withdrawal when encirclement was developing. Pattern from Eastern Front was repeating exactly in West. Professional military doctrine about defensive flexibility was being overridden by rigid political orders. Commanders who could see encirclement developing could not respond with tactical withdrawals because policy forbade flexibility. The systematic destruction of German defensive capability through elimination of tactical flexibility was occurring on both fronts simultaneously. Wehrmacht possessed expertise to conduct effective mobile defense. Political system prevented implementing that expertise by requiring static defense regardless of tactical circumstances. In December 1944, Hitler committed Germany's last mobile reserves to Ardennes offensive. When offensive stalled, professional assessment was that forces should be withdrawn to preserve them for defensive operations. Hitler ordered continued attacks regardless of results. Wehrmacht commanders calculated that forces wasted in continued Ardennes operations after initial momentum was lost could be defending Germany against Soviet winter offensive. No retreat mentality applied to offensive as well as defensive operations. Once committed, forces must continue regardless of whether operational objectives were achievable. Professional military judgment said knowing when to stop unsuccessful operations was as important as knowing when to retreat from untenable positions. Political decision was that determination required continuing operations regardless of tactical reality. Ardennes forces were eventually withdrawn, but only after weeks of additional combat consuming forces for no operational gain. When Soviet January offensive struck, Wehrmacht defensive reserves were reduced because forces were wasted in Ardennes after professional assessments said operation should be terminated. No retreat policy's elimination of tactical flexibility applied to entire operational decision-making. Neither tactical withdrawals nor operational terminations were acceptable even when professional expertise said they were necessary. The cost was cumulative degradation of German military effectiveness across all operational levels. Wehrmacht post-war professional analysis of no-retreat policy was comprehensive and damning. Staff officers calculated that approximately 1 million troops were lost in situations where professional military doctrine indicated tactical retreat was appropriate but policy forbade withdrawal. These were not combat losses achieving strategic objectives, they were forces deliberately sacrificed because rigid orders prevented tactical flexibility. Analysis documented specific pattern.
Commanders identified that retreat was necessary, requested authorization, or denied, forces were encircled and destroyed.
Pattern repeated across all theaters from 1942 through 1945.
Professional assessment was that German defensive capabilities were systematically destroyed by policy eliminating tactical flexibility that doctrine said was essential for effective defense.
Wehrmacht possessed world-class expertise in defensive operations.
Professional commanders understood mobile defense, tactical withdrawals, and force preservation.
This expertise could not be implemented because political system required static defense regardless of circumstances.
Analysis calculated that if tactical flexibility had been maintained, allowing commanders to conduct withdrawals when professional judgment indicated necessity, German defensive campaign would have been substantially more effective and forces would have been preserved for continued operations. The cost of no-retreat policy was measurable. Approximately 1 million troops unnecessarily lost and systematic degradation of defensive effectiveness by making operations rigid and predictable.
Military historians analyzing German defensive operations 1942-45 consistently examine counterfactual. What if Wehrmacht had maintained tactical flexibility rather than no-retreat rigidity? Professional military doctrine about defensive operations was sound.
Commanders were trained and competent. If doctrine had been implemented allowing tactical withdrawals when circumstances required, conducting mobile defense, prioritizing force preservation over holding terrain, German defensive capabilities would have been substantially more effective.
The counterfactual is calculable.
Forces lost in pockets because retreats were forbidden: Stalingrad, Cherkasy, Korsun, Budapest, Königsberg, Falaise, and dozens of smaller encirclements totaled approximately 1 million troops. These forces would have been available for continued operations if tactical flexibility had been permitted.
Soviet and Allied advances would have faced more effective German defense. German collapse would have been delayed and potentially less catastrophic.
This does not suggest German victory. Allied resources ensured eventual defeat.
But the manner of defeat was affected by no-retreat policy. Germany collapsed more rapidly because forces were systematically destroyed in situations where professional expertise said they should withdraw.
Operational competence existed to conduct effective defense. Political system prevented implementing that competence by requiring rigidity that doctrine warned would guarantee force destruction. The counterfactual shows cost of eliminating tactical flexibility: 1 million troops and substantially reduced defensive effectiveness. When historians assess German strategic failures, no-retreat policy appears consistently as systematic dysfunction where political rigidity destroyed military effectiveness. Pattern was clear from December 1941 through war's end. Professional military doctrine said defensive operations required tactical flexibility. Hitler ordered blanket prohibition on retreats regardless of circumstances. Wehrmacht commanders who followed professional judgment were relieved while those who obeyed rigid orders watched forces be destroyed.
Pattern repeated across all theaters with identical results.
Professional military expertise correctly identified that tactical flexibility was essential for effective defense.
Political decision-making structure prevented implementing that expertise by requiring static defense regardless of operational reality.
The cost was catastrophic: approximately 1 million troops lost in situations where professional assessment indicated retreat was necessary, systematic degradation of German defensive effectiveness by making operations predictable and rigid, punishment of competent commanders who followed operational doctrine,
and institutionalization of dysfunction where tactical judgment was subordinated to blanket orders. Germany possessed professional military expertise about defensive warfare. Wehrmacht doctrine was sound.
Commanders were trained and competent.
Germany lost partly because political system prevented implementing professional expertise whenever tactical reality required flexibility that political orders forbade. Stalingrad was not aberration, it was template repeated systematically until defeat because decision-making structure valued rigid determination more than tactical effectiveness and professional judgment more than political obedience. Wehrmacht effectiveness was destroyed not by lack of expertise but by systematic prevention of implementing that expertise through blanket policy eliminating tactical flexibility that professional doctrine correctly identified as essential for defensive operations.